The thermometer outside Emmett Thorne's door read -30 degrees on that January morning in 1880, but inside his cabin, the mercury held steady at +11. While his neighbors burned through cords of wood just to keep their children from freezing, Emmett sat comfortably by a modest fire, his unusual home maintaining a 41-degree difference from the brutal Dakota winter outside. Before we dive into how one man's grief turned into the most ridiculed and then most copied innovation on the northern frontier, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten frontier ingenuity move you, hit that subscribe button. The cabin felt wrong the moment Emmett Thorne pushed through the door. He had left a solid fire burning in the stone hearth 3 hours earlier, enough split oak to keep the interior warm, while he and Oscar Lindstrom checked their northern trap line. But the air inside hit his face with barely more warmth than the December wind outside. His breath formed clouds in the dim interior. Something was fundamentally broken about this equation. Oscar stomped snow from his boots and moved immediately to the fireplace. Coals still glowed orange beneath a layer of ash. The fire hadn't died. It had burned exactly as it should have. Yet the cabin's interior temperature felt perhaps 5 degrees warmer than the outside air, maybe 10 at most. Oscar held his hands toward the residual heat, and Emmett noticed his partner's fingers had gone white at the tips. "We need to build that fire back up," Emmett said, already moving toward their wood stack in the corner. "Your hands are showing frost." Oscar looked at his fingers as if noticing them for the first time, then flexed them experimentally. "It is nothing. They will recover by the fire. But this cold, Emmett, this is different from winters past. This is the cold that kills." They had been partners for 3 seasons, working beaver and muskrat along the tributaries that fed into the James River in Dakota Territory. Oscar was 12 years older, a Swedish immigrant who had come west after his wife died in childbirth back in Minnesota. Emmett was 28, raised in Ohio, drawn to the frontier by the promise of land and independence. They had built this cabin together the previous spring, following the standard practice every trapper knew. Notched logs at the corners, mud and moss chinking, a stone fireplace, a single door, one window with oiled paper covering. 4 days of work for 2 men. It had seemed adequate in September. In December of 1878, it felt like a death trap. Emmett fed wood into the fireplace and watched flames climb around the fresh fuel. Within minutes, heat radiated into the small space. But even as the fire built to a roaring blaze, he could feel cold air moving through gaps in the chinking, could sense the way warmth seemed to flee through the walls and roof as fast as the fire could generate it. The cabin was a sieve. Heat poured in through the fireplace and leaked out through 100 invisible cracks and gaps. Oscar removed his outer coat and hung it on a peg near the door, moving closer to the fire. His fingers had regained some color, but the white patches at the tips remained. Frostbite. Not severe yet, but present. In a properly warm cabin, a man's fingers should not frost during a 3-hour absence, not when he had left behind a burning fire. "How much wood did we burn today?" Oscar asked, warming his hands. Emmett looked at their depleted stack. "Half a cord since yesterday morning. At this rate we will run through our winter supply by February. Then we cut more. There is only so much cutting we can do when every day is this cold." Emmett sat on the rough bench they had built from split logs. "And it does not solve the real problem." Oscar glanced at him. "Which is? This cabin does not hold heat. We are feeding a fire that warms nothing but the air immediately around it. Everything else escapes." The temperature dropped 20 degrees after sunset. Emmett woke twice during the night to feed the fire, and each time he found Oscar already awake, huddled near the hearth with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. The cold had become a physical presence in the cabin, pressing against them from all sides despite the flames that consumed their carefully split wood. By morning, the wind had risen to a steady howl. Snow fell in thick curtains that reduced visibility to mere yards. Emmett could barely see the woodpile 15 feet from their door. He pulled on his heaviest coat and stepped outside to bring in more fuel. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and burning his exposed skin within seconds. Inside, Oscar was preparing coffee over the fire, moving slowly in a way that concerned Emmett. His partner's face looked drawn, older somehow than it had the previous day. "We should stay close to the cabin today," Emmett said, stacking wood near the hearth. "This storm is only getting worse." Oscar nodded, but said nothing. They ate a breakfast of fried salt pork and cornmeal mush, washing it down with bitter coffee. The meal was consumed in silence. Both men focused on the simple act of eating, of maintaining the routines that kept them human in this frozen wilderness. Around mid-morning, Oscar stood abruptly. "The north line. I set traps 3 days ago that need checking." "That can wait," Emmett said. "Nothing is worth going out in this. Those traps represent money. We cannot afford to lose them to scavengers or have animals suffer in them for days." Oscar was already pulling on his outer layers. "I will be quick. 2 hours at most. The line is not far." Emmett wanted to argue, wanted to insist they both stay inside, but he understood the calculation Oscar was making. Those traps did represent money. More than that, they represented the difference between a successful season and a failed one. And Oscar was right. The north line was close, less than a mile, in normal weather, an easy walk. "Then I am going with you," Emmett said, reaching for his coat. "No." Oscar's tone was firm. "One of us should stay and tend the fire. If we both go and return frozen, we will need warmth immediately. Better one goes, one maintains the cabin." The logic was sound, and Emmett recognized the stubborn set of Oscar's jaw that meant arguing would accomplish nothing. 2 hours, he said. "If you are not back in 2 hours, I am coming to find you." Oscar smiled slightly. "I will be back in less. This is simple work." He stepped out into the storm, and Emmett watched through the small window as his partner's form disappeared into the white wall of falling snow within seconds. The wind howled around the cabin's corners. Emmett fed more wood to the fire and settled in to wait. 2 hours passed, then 3. Oscar did not return. Emmett found Oscar 300 yards from the cabin, curled against the base of a cottonwood tree. His partner had gotten disoriented in the whiteout conditions, had wandered in the wrong direction, and by the time he realized his mistake, the cold had already stolen his ability to think clearly. He had sat down to rest. In that kind of cold, sitting down meant death. The ground was frozen too hard to dig, so Emmett wrapped Oscar's body in canvas and stored it in their small equipment shed until the spring thaw would allow for proper burial. For 3 days he remained in the cabin alone, keeping the fire burning, consuming their wood supply at an alarming rate, just to maintain barely tolerable temperatures inside the small structure. When the storm finally broke, Emmett faced the grim task of telling the other trappers scattered throughout the territory. He made the rounds on snowshoes, visiting the few occupied cabins within a day's travel, spreading the news of Oscar's death. The responses were uniformly sympathetic, but unsurprising. Men died in the territories. Cold killed as reliably as bears or accidents or disease. It was the price of the life they had chosen. But Emmett could not accept that simple equation. Oscar had not died because of bad luck or poor judgment. He had died because their cabin, built according to every standard practice known on the frontier, had failed to provide adequate protection against cold that was severe but not unprecedented. Trappers and settlers had endured winters like this before. The question that haunted Emmett was why some survived and others froze. He began paying attention to details he had previously ignored. When visiting other cabins to share news of Oscar's death, he noticed the interior temperatures. Some cabins felt marginally warmer than others despite similar construction. Some trappers burned through wood faster. Some seemed to have found methods of retaining heat that Emmett did not understand. One cabin in particular caught his attention. Ernst Baumann, a German immigrant who trapped the eastern. Tributaries had built his structure against a large rock outcropping. The stone face formed one entire wall of his cabin. Ernst explained that the rock held heat from the sun during the day and released it slowly at night. It was not much, but it made a measurable difference. The observation lodged in Emmett's mind. Stone held heat. Not perfectly, but better than nothing. It was a small piece of a larger puzzle he had not yet assembled. When spring finally arrived and the ground thawed, Emmett buried Oscar on a hillside, overlooking the river where they had worked together. He marked the grave with stones and stood there for a long time, looking at the simple cairn. The abandoned territorial jail sat on the western edge of the settlement, a hulking stone structure that most people avoided. It had been built 8 years earlier when the county seat was located here, a solid investment in civilization's infrastructure. But when the railroad chose a route 20 miles south, the county government moved with it. The jail was left empty, a monument to ambitions that had shifted elsewhere. Emmett had passed the building dozens of times without giving it serious thought. It was just another piece of frontier detritus, the kind of abandoned structure that dotted the territories wherever boom had turned to bust. But in the weeks after Oscar's burial, as spring slowly displaced winter's grip, Emmett found himself drawn to the old jail with increasing frequency. The building was constructed from local limestone, blocks quarried from deposits along the river and hauled to the site by wagon. The walls were 2 feet thick, designed to contain prisoners securely and to project the authority of territorial law. There were 6 cells on the ground floor, each with iron-barred doors that still hung on their hinges. A second story had served as the sheriff's office and living quarters. The roof was intact, solid wooden beams covered with split shingles that had weathered but not failed. What interested Emmett was the temperature inside. Even on cool spring days, the jail's interior felt noticeably warmer than the outside air. The thick stone walls blocked the wind completely, creating a still environment where even residual warmth seemed to accumulate and linger. On sunny days, the southern wall absorbed heat and radiated it inward. The effect was subtle but measurable. Emmett began visiting the jail regularly, sometimes spending hours inside the empty structure. He brought his thermometer, the same instrument he had used throughout the terrible winter, and took readings at different times of day. Exterior temperature, interior temperature, variations between the ground floor and upper story. He recorded everything in a small notebook, building a catalog of data that revealed patterns. The stone walls blocked wind but conducted cold. On frigid nights, the interior temperature dropped until it nearly matched the exterior, though the descent was slower than in open air. During the day, solar heating raised interior temperatures significantly, sometimes 15 degrees above outside air. The thermal mass of the stone meant changes happened gradually. The building resisted both heating and cooling, maintaining whatever temperature it achieved for extended periods. Most people would have seen an abandoned jail. Emmett saw a thermal battery, a structure that accumulated and stored heat energy in ways that wood construction could not match. But he also recognized its limitations. Stone alone was not the answer. The jail's interior still grew dangerously cold during extended freezes. It was better than nothing, superior to standing in open wind, but insufficient for human survival in severe conditions. Emmett's experiments became methodical through late spring and into summer of 1879. He established 3 measurement points: open prairie half a mile from any structure, his own log cabin, and the abandoned jail's interior. Every morning at dawn and every evening at sunset, he recorded temperatures at all 3 locations. The data accumulated in his notebook, columns of numbers that revealed truths most frontiersmen never considered. The open prairie showed the widest temperature swings. Morning readings could be 40 degrees colder than afternoon peaks. Wind was the critical factor. Even on days with moderate air temperatures, high wind created conditions that stole body heat with ruthless efficiency. A man could freeze on a windy day at temperatures that seemed survivable on paper. His log cabin performed better than open prairie, but showed disturbing characteristics. Interior temperatures tracked exterior conditions closely, lagging behind by only a few hours. When outside air warmed, the cabin warmed. When outside air dropped, the cabin dropped with it. The fireplace could overwhelm this pattern temporarily, raising interior temperature significantly. But the moment the fire diminished, cold reasserted itself. The cabin had no thermal mass, no ability to store heat energy. It was simply a windbreak with a heat source, nothing more. The jail showed different behavior entirely. Its thick stone walls resisted temperature change in both directions. Morning cold persisted inside well into afternoon. Afternoon warmth lingered long after sunset. The building fought against change, maintaining whatever thermal state it had achieved until overwhelming force from outside altered it gradually over many hours. Emmett began to understand the fundamental problem. Wood construction was light and quick to build, but it held no heat. A wooden cabin was thermally passive, simply dividing interior space from exterior wind while allowing temperature to equalize rapidly through countless small gaps and the conductive properties of thin walls. Stone construction had thermal mass that resisted change, but stone conducted cold efficiently. A stone building's interior eventually matched exterior temperature, just more slowly than wood. Neither solution alone solved the problem of surviving extreme cold while conserving fuel. What Emmett needed was a way to combine the advantages of both while eliminating their individual weaknesses. He spent long evenings sketching ideas in his notebook. Most were impractical or impossible given frontier materials and tools. But one concept kept returning to his mind with increasing insistence. What if you built a wooden cabin inside a stone structure, not against the stone wall like Ernst Baumann's rock outcropping cabin, but truly inside, with empty space between the two structures? The air gap would be the key. Dead air, trapped between stone and wood, would act as insulation. The stone would block wind and provide thermal mass. The wood would create a second barrier and hold heat from an interior fire. Heat would accumulate in the inner cabin, radiating outward slowly. The air gap would slow that radiation. The stone would absorb what did escape and release it gradually. On paper, the system seemed sound. Stone blocked convective heat loss from wind. Air gap blocked conductive heat loss through materials. Wood provided a final barrier and living space. Each layer addressed a specific mechanism of heat escape. Sheriff Marcus Grayson maintained an office in the settlement despite the county seat having moved south years earlier. He handled local disputes, recorded claims, and served as the de facto authority for administrative matters affecting the scattered population of trappers, farmers, and merchants who remained in the area. When Emmett approached him about purchasing the abandoned jail, Grayson assumed the request involved salvaging building materials. "The stone is solid," Grayson said, leaning back in his chair behind a scarred wooden desk. "If you want to quarry it for your own construction, I can arrange a sale. The territorial government has no use for the building. They would be happy to recoup any value from it." "I do not want to quarry it," Emmett said. "I want to purchase it intact. The entire structure, as it stands." Grayson's eyebrows rose. "The whole building? What would you do with an old jail?" "Live in it. The cells are not exactly comfortable living quarters. I plan to build a cabin inside it." The sheriff stared at him for a long moment, then laughed. It was not cruel laughter, just genuine amusement at an idea that struck him as absurd. "You want to build a cabin inside a building that is already a building?" "Yes. Why not just live in the jail itself? Stone walls, solid roof, fix up the sheriff's quarters upstairs, and you would have perfectly adequate shelter." Emmett had anticipated this question. "Stone conducts cold. The jail's interior freezes nearly as cold as the outside air during winter, But if I build a wooden cabin inside those stone walls with airspace between them, the combination will hold heat far better than either structure alone." Grayson considered this as his expression shifting from amusement to something closer to concern. "Emmett, I heard about Oscar. I know this winter was hard on you, but building a cabin inside a building seems like a lot of effort for questionable gain. Why not just build a better cabin in the normal fashion?" "Because normal fashion does not work. I have measured temperatures all spring. I know exactly how much heat a standard cabin loses and how much wood it requires to compensate. What I am proposing will reduce fuel consumption by half while maintaining warmer interior temperatures." The sheriff drummed his fingers on his desk. "This is about Oscar freezing, is it not?" "This is about not freezing myself. Oscar's death taught me that our standard methods of building are inadequate for the conditions we face here. I am not trying to honor his memory. I am trying to survive." Grayson sighed. "The building is yours for $20. I will draw up a deed. But Emmett, people are going to think you have lost your mind." News spread through the small settlement within days. Emmett Thorne was building a cabin inside the old jail. The reaction was predictably skeptical, shading quickly into open mockery. In a community where practical efficiency was valued above almost everything else, Emmett's plan seemed like the epitome of wasted effort. Cyrus Wellborn was the most vocal critic. He operated a small trading post and considered himself the settlement's unofficial voice of common sense. When Emmett came to purchase nails and hardware, Cyrus could not resist commentary. "Heard you bought the old jail," Cyrus said, counting out square nails onto his scale. "Planning to lock yourself up for past crimes?" "Planning to build living quarters," Emmett replied evenly. "Living quarters inside a building that already has living quarters. That strikes me as redundant." Cyrus grinned at his own wit. "Why not just move into the sheriff's old rooms upstairs? Save yourself the lumber and labor." "The stone is too cold. I need wood construction for proper insulation." "So build a wooden cabin like a normal person. Plenty of good sites available. No need to build inside somebody else's building." Emmett paid for the nails and gathered his purchases. "The stone walls will block wind and provide thermal mass. The wooden cabin will create a secondary barrier with an air gap between them. The system will retain heat far more efficiently than standard construction." Cyrus stared at him blankly. "You are building two buildings, one inside the other, to do the job that one building should do?" "I am building one system that combines the advantages of two different construction methods." "Sounds like you are wasting time and money to me, but it is your time and your money, I suppose." Cyrus shook his head. "People are going to talk, Emmett. They already are talking. Thorne's folly, they are calling it. Man builds a cabin inside a cabin because grief broke his brain." "Let them talk," Emmett said, and left the trading post with his supplies. But Cyrus was right about one thing. People did talk. Everywhere Emmett went in the settlement, he encountered raised eyebrows, smirks, and barely concealed amusement. The trappers thought he was wasting effort on an overcomplicated solution to a simple problem. The few farmers in the area thought he was still mad with grief over Oscar's death. Even Ernst Baumann, who had shown Emmett his own innovation with the rock outcropping, thought building inside the jail was excessive. "I understand trying to improve shelter," Ernst said when he visited Emmett at the jail site, "but this seems like building twice when building once should suffice." Emmett was measuring the interior dimensions of the largest cell block, planning where his cabin's walls would sit. Building once does not suffice. That is what killed Oscar. Emmett spent 2 full weeks inside the jail doing nothing but measuring, calculating, and planning before he cut a single log. Other settlers saw this as further evidence of his obsession bordering on madness. Normal cabin construction did not require extensive planning. You cut logs to appropriate length, notched them at the corners, stacked them until you reached the desired height, added a roof, and the work was done. 4 days for 2 men, perhaps a week for one, working alone. But Emmett was not building a normal cabin. He was building a precision system where every dimension mattered, where the relationship between inner and outer structures would determine success or failure. The air gap was critical, too narrow, and convective currents would transfer heat from the inner cabin to the stone walls too efficiently, too wide, and he would waste the jail's interior space while gaining no additional insulation benefit. He settled on 3 feet as the optimal distance, wide enough to create dead air space, narrow enough to be practical. The jail's main cell block was 20 feet wide and 30 feet long. Subtracting 3 feet on each side for the air gap left him with an interior cabin 14 feet wide and 24 feet long. That was actually larger than most trapper cabins, generous space for one man living alone. The height presented different considerations. The jail's ceiling was 12 feet high. Emmett planned an 8-foot interior ceiling, leaving 4 feet of airspace above. That upper gap would be crucial for routing his chimney and for allowing warm air to rise away from the cabin's roof before it could conduct heat to the stone ceiling above. He mapped every detail in his notebook. The cabin would sit centered in the cell block, leaving equal air gaps on all 4 sides. The door would face the jail's main entrance, creating an airlock effect where someone entering would pass through the heavy outer iron door, cross 6 feet of airspace, then enter the cabin's wooden door. 2 barriers instead of 1, with dead air between them. Window placement required careful thought. The jail had narrow barred windows high on the southern wall. Emmett planned to align his cabin's windows with these openings, allowing light to enter while maintaining the air gap's integrity. He would build wooden shutters for his cabin windows and leave the jail's iron bars in place. The combination would provide light, ventilation when needed, and security. The fireplace was his greatest challenge. He needed to build a stone hearth and chimney inside the cabin, then route the chimney up through the cabin's roof, across the 4-foot air gap, and into the jail's existing chimney system. The connection had to be precise. Any gap would allow smoke to fill the airspace between structures, defeating the purpose of the design. He spent 3 days working out the geometry, sketching cross-sections and elevation views, until he understood exactly how every piece would fit together. Ernst Baumann visited again during this planning phase and found Emmett sitting on the jail's stone floor, surrounded by papers covered in drawings and calculations. "You have not even started building yet," Ernst observed. "I am building," Emmett said without looking up from his sketches. "I am building it in my mind first so I do not have to rebuild it with my hands later." "How much longer will you plan?" "Until I am certain of every measurement and every joint." Ernst shook his head. "Winter will come whether you are ready or not. Then I will finish before winter comes, but I will not start until the plan is complete." The actual construction began in mid-June of 1879. Emmett started by hauling logs, selecting trees with obsessive care. He wanted straight-grained pine, uniform diameter, minimal taper. Each tree had to meet his standards before he would cut it. Other trappers used whatever timber was convenient. Emmett walked miles to find trees that matched his specifications, then spent days hauling them back to the jail site. He worked alone. No one offered to help, and he did not ask. The community had made its opinion clear. This was Thorne's folly, and he could pursue it without assistance. That suited Emmett fine. He had learned from Oscar's death that survival was ultimately an individual responsibility. You could partner with others, could share labor and resources, but in the end, a man's survival depended on his own preparation and his own shelter. The logs were stripped completely, every bit of bark removed with a draw knife. The process was backbreaking. Each log required hours of work, shaping the surface until it was smooth and uniform. Emmett's hands developed calluses on top of existing calluses. His shoulders ached constantly, but the work produced logs that would fit together with minimal gaps, logs that would create tight walls, requiring less chinking. He laid the first course of logs directly on the jail's stone floor, using wooden shims to level them precisely. The floor was not perfectly flat. dipping slightly toward the center where decades of foot traffic had worn the stone. Emmett compensated with careful shimming, creating a level foundation for the walls that would rise above it. The corners were constructed using traditional saddle notching. Emmett considered other methods but recognized that for interior construction, protected from weather, standard notching would provide adequate strength. What mattered more was the precision of each notch, ensuring logs seated tightly without gaps. He cut each notch carefully, testing the fit multiple times before committing to final dimensions. The walls rose slowly. One course of logs every 2 days on average. Stack, notch, fit, adjust, chink. Repeat. The work was meditative in its repetition, allowing Emmett's mind to focus completely on the physical task while the summer heat built inside the stone jail. The thick walls kept the interior cooler than outside air, but working in the enclosed space was still demanding. Sweat dripped steadily as he muscled heavy logs into position. By late July, the walls had reached 6 feet. Emmett built a door frame into the eastern wall, leaving an opening 4 feet wide and 7 feet tall. The frame was constructed from heavier timbers, mortised and pegged to create a rigid structure that would support the door's weight without sagging. He planned to hang a thick plank door with iron hinges, creating a seal tight enough to prevent air movement between the cabin's interior and the surrounding air gap. The window openings were placed to align with the jail's external windows. Emmett cut 2 openings on the southern wall, each 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall, positioned 6 feet above the floor. The height would allow light to enter while maintaining privacy and security. He framed each opening with the same care he had given the door, creating solid supports that would hold shutters securely. The entrance sequence became Emmett's most sophisticated design element. He had observed during his temperature measurements that heat escaped most readily through openings. Doors were necessary for access, but every time a door opened, warm interior air rushed out and cold exterior air flooded in. A single door, no matter how well fitted, created a direct connection between inside and outside. Heat leaked around the edges constantly, and opening the door even briefly could drop interior temperature noticeably. Emmett's solution was to eliminate any direct connection between his cabin's interior and the outside world. The jail's main entrance had a heavy iron door that still functioned perfectly despite years of abandonment. The door was 3 inches of solid iron-banded oak, designed to contain prisoners and resist forced entry. It hung on massive hinges bolted through the stone door frame. When closed, it sealed against a rabbeted frame that minimized gaps. That door became his outer barrier. Emmett cleaned the hinges, oiled the metal components, and repaired minor damage to the wood. The door, still closed solidly, latching with an iron bar that dropped into brackets on the interior. He left this system intact, maintaining the jail's original entrance as his first line of defense against cold. His cabin door stood 24 feet inside the jail, across the open cell block space that now served as an airlock. This second door was Emmett's own construction, built from thick planks hewn from a single large pine. He selected the densest wood he could find, heartwood from an old tree that had grown slowly in poor soil, creating tight grain that resisted splitting and warping. The door was assembled using tongue and groove joinery, each plank fitting into its neighbor with mechanical precision. Emmett cut the tongues and grooves by hand using a specially sharpened chisel, working slowly to ensure perfect alignment. When assembled, the planks created a door that was effectively a single solid piece with no gaps for air to pass through. The door was 3 inches thick and weighed nearly 80 pounds. He reinforced it with 2 diagonal braces on the interior face, iron straps he had purchased from Cyrus Wellborn's trading post. The straps were bolted through the door, creating an X pattern that prevented any warping or twisting. The door could support its own weight across the 4-foot width without sagging. The hinges were mounted into mortises cut into both the door and the frame, then through-bolted with iron pins. To remove the door, someone would have to destroy either the door itself or the frame. Simply prying at the hinges would accomplish nothing. The locking mechanism was a heavy wooden beam that slid horizontally through iron brackets mounted to the door's interior face. When engaged, the beam extended into a mortise cut into the adjacent wall log, physically connecting the door to the cabin structure. The door could not be opened without first withdrawing the beam, and the beam could only be withdrawn from inside. The result was a two-door system with 6 feet of airspace between them. Entering or leaving required opening the outer iron door, crossing the dark cell block space, then opening or closing the inner wooden door. At no point did the interior of the cabin connect directly to outside air. The airlock trapped cold air in the space between doors, preventing it from reaching the cabin's interior. The cabin was completed in early September of 1879. 3 months of work had transformed the jail's main cell block into something unprecedented on the frontier. The wooden structure sat centered in the stone shell, 3 feet of empty air separating wood from stone on all sides. The door was hung and fitted. The windows had shutters that closed tightly. The fireplace was built and tested, its chimney routing up through the cabin's roof, across the air gap, and into the jail's original chimney system. Emmett moved his possessions from the old cabin he had shared with Oscar. There was not much to move. A sleeping platform frame, blankets, cooking equipment, tools, traps, his remaining supply of food staples, and the few personal items that constituted his entire material existence. Everything fit into the new space with room to spare. The cabin's interior felt spacious compared to the cramped quarters he was accustomed to. He arranged the interior with deliberate thought. The sleeping platform went against the north wall, farthest from the door. The table and chairs sat near the south windows where daylight would illuminate meals and any work requiring good light. Shelves mounted on the east and west walls held supplies organized by frequency of use. The fireplace dominated the west wall, its stone hearth extending several feet into the room. The first fire in the new fireplace was a test. Emmett built it slowly, starting with kindling and adding larger pieces gradually, watching how the chimney drew and whether smoke escaped into the cabin or the surrounding air gap. The draw was excellent. Smoke rose through the cabin's chimney, crossed the air gap in the sealed connector he had built, and exited through the jail's main chimney high above. No smoke leaked into either the cabin or the airlock space. More importantly, the heat behavior was immediately different from any cabin he had experienced. The fireplace warmed the cabin's interior rapidly, but instead of that heat disappearing into the walls and roof, it accumulated. Within an hour, the entire cabin felt warm. Within 2 hours, it felt genuinely comfortable. Emmett let the fire burn down to coals and watched what happened. In a normal cabin, temperature would have dropped quickly as the fire diminished. In his new structure, temperature held steady. The wooden walls had absorbed heat and were releasing it slowly. That heat radiated across the air gap toward the stone walls. But the 3 feet of dead air slowed the transfer dramatically. The stone walls eventually absorbed some of that heat, warming gradually, but the process took hours instead of minutes. As evening approached and outside temperature dropped, Emmett added more wood to the fire and settled in for his first night in the new cabin. He had brought his thermometer and took measurements every hour. Outside air temperature dropped to 42 degrees. The jail's cell block space, measured in the airlock between doors, registered 48 degrees. Inside the cabin, temperature held at 67 degrees. The differential was remarkable. 25 degrees warmer than outside air, maintained with a modest fire burning less wood than he would have needed in a standard cabin to achieve half that comfort. September and October were mild. Daytime temperatures remained comfortable, and nighttime cold was minimal. Emmett's cabin stayed warm easily, but so did every other structure in the settlement. The true test would come with winter, and everyone knew it. Until then, his elaborate construction proved nothing except that he had invested enormous effort into a system that might be unnecessary. Cyrus Wellborn continued his commentary whenever Emmett appeared at the trading post. "Heard you finally moved into your fortress," Cyrus said one afternoon in late October. "How does it feel living in a jail cell surrounded by a cabin, surrounded by more jail cells?" "It feels warm," Emmett replied, purchasing lamp oil and coffee. "Everything feels warm in October. Come back in January and tell me if your double building was worth 3 months of work." Cyrus measured out coffee beans onto his scale. "I put up a new cabin this summer. Took me 5 days. 5 days versus your 3 months. Even if your system worked slightly better, was it worth 50 times the effort?" Emmett had learned not to argue. Words would not convince Cyrus or anyone else. Only winter would prove whether his calculations and construction had merit. "I will let you know in January," he said, and left with his supplies. The settlement's population was small, perhaps 40 permanent residents scattered across several square miles. Most were trappers like Emmett, living alone or in small partnerships. A few families had established farms on the better land near the river. Cyrus's trading post served as the community's commercial center and informal gathering place. Information and gossip flowed through the trading post with reliable regularity. Emmett heard the stories that circulated about him. Thorne's Folly had become Thorne's Fortress in common parlance. People speculated about his mental state. Some thought grief over Oscar's death had unbalanced him. Others thought he was simply eccentric, a man who overcomplicated simple problems. A few thought he was clever, but wasting his cleverness on unnecessary innovation. Ernst Baumann remained friendly but skeptical. He visited the jail in early November, curious to see the finished interior. Emmett gave him a tour, explaining the air gap principle and the thermal mass theory behind the design. Ernst listened politely, examined the construction with a craftsman's eye, and offered measured praise. "The workmanship is excellent," Ernst said, running his hand along the smooth interior wall logs. "You have built this very well, but I still question whether it will perform significantly better than a well-built standard cabin." "It already performs better," Emmett said. "I have been measuring temperatures. My fireplace uses half the wood to maintain the same interior temperature I had in my old cabin." "In autumn, yes. But autumn is forgiving. Winter will tell the real story." Ernst looked up at the cabin ceiling, then at the stone jail ceiling, visible 4 feet above it. "I hope for your sake that this works, Emmett. I truly do. But I think you may have solved a problem that did not need such an elaborate solution." November brought the first serious cold. Temperatures dropped below freezing at night, and thin ice formed on still water. Snow fell in intermittent bursts, dusting the ground white before melting in afternoon sun. The settlement's residents began winter preparations in earnest, cutting final loads of firewood, checking cabin chinking, ensuring food supplies were adequate for the months of isolation ahead. Emmett had already completed his preparations. His woodpile was substantial but not excessive. He had calculated fuel requirements based on his autumn observations and cut accordingly. Other trappers had woodpiles twice the size of his, anticipating the enormous consumption required to heat standard cabins through Dakota winter. Cyrus Wellborn noticed the difference when passing the jail one afternoon. "That is all the wood you have?" Cyrus called out, gesturing at Emmett's stacked cords. "That is sufficient," Emmett replied. "You will freeze by February if that is all you have. I cut 3 times that much for my own cabin, and I'm not even sure it will last the winter. I use less wood than you do. The calculations are sound." Cyrus shook his head. "You are going to learn a hard lesson about underestimating winter, Emmett. Pride will not keep you warm when you run out of fuel in the coldest months." But December proved Emmett's calculations correct. As temperatures dropped into the 20s and teens, his fireplace maintained comfortable interior temperatures while consuming wood at the modest rate he had predicted. Meanwhile, other cabins in the settlement burned through fuel at alarming rates. Settlers who had thought themselves adequately prepared began rationing wood, letting fires burn lower at night, accepting colder interior temperatures to stretch supplies. By late December, conditions had deteriorated beyond normal winter cold. The temperatures were dropping into single digits at night. Sustained winds from the north brought Arctic air down from Canada, creating conditions that tested every structure's ability to provide shelter. This was not exceptional cold yet, not the killing temperatures that had claimed Oscar's life the previous year, but it was cold enough to reveal weaknesses in construction and preparation. Ernst Baumann stopped at the jail on Christmas Eve, ostensibly to wish Emmett well for the holiday, but really to satisfy his curiosity about how the double structure system was performing. Emmett invited him inside through the airlock, and Ernst immediately noticed the temperature difference. "It is genuinely warm in here," Ernst said, removing his heavy coat. "How much wood are you burning?" "One fire in the morning, one in the evening. Small fires, just enough to maintain temperature. The structure holds heat between firings." "My cabin requires constant fire. If I let it die, interior temperature drops to near freezing within hours." Ernst looked around the interior with new respect. "I may owe you an apology, Emmett. This actually works." January of 1880 brought cold that surpassed anything in living memory. The Arctic air that had settled over the territory in December intensified, pushing temperatures down to levels that shocked even veteran frontiersmen. By the second week of January, nighttime temperatures were reaching 20 below zero. By the third week, they had dropped to 30 below. The cold was not just severe, it was sustained, holding for days without relief. Emmett woke on January 18th to a world transformed by cold. Frost covered the inside of the jail's barred windows, thick enough to obscure the view outside. The iron door at the jail's entrance had ice crystals forming around its edges. The cell block space between that outer door and his cabin door was bitterly cold, breath-forming thick clouds that hung in the still air. But inside the cabin, warmth persisted. Emmett had let his evening fire burn down to coals before sleeping, adding no wood through the night. The interior temperature had dropped from the 68 degrees he maintained during waking hours, but it had not dropped catastrophically. He rekindled the fire and set his thermometer outside through a small port he had built into the south wall specifically for this purpose. The mercury plummeted. Emmett watched it drop to the bottom of the scale, then consulted a more specialized instrument he had purchased from a scientific supply house in St. Louis during the previous summer. This thermometer could measure down to 50 below zero. The reading stabilized at negative 30 degrees. He recorded the number in his notebook, then measured the airlock temperature by opening his cabin door briefly and placing the thermometer in the cell block space. The air there was cold enough to burn his lungs when he breathed it, but the thermometer showed negative 8 degrees. The stone walls were providing 22 degrees of warming simply by blocking wind and providing thermal mass. Inside the cabin, with the fire rebuilt to a modest blaze, temperature climbed quickly to positive 11 degrees. Emmett sat at his table and did the arithmetic. Exterior temperature negative 30, interior temperature positive 11. Total differential of 41 degrees. He had built a structure that maintained an environment 41 degrees warmer than the outside world while burning a fraction of the wood that standard cabins required. The system worked exactly as his calculations had predicted. Better, actually. He had hoped for 30-degree differential. The reality exceeded his expectations. Outside, the settlement was suffering. Emmett did not need to leave his warm cabin to know this. He had lived through the previous winter, had seen what extreme cold did to standard frontier construction. People would be burning wood desperately, feeding fires constantly, and still watching their water buckets freeze solid inside their homes. Children would be sleeping in layers of blankets near fireplaces. Adults would be making impossible calculations about fuel consumption versus remaining supply. The cold held for 6 days. Each morning, Emmett took his measurements. Exterior temperature varied between negative 25 and negative 35. His cabin's interior never dropped below positive 8 degrees, even when he let the fire die completely overnight. With modest fires morning and evening, he maintained temperatures between +10 and +15 degrees comfortably. His wood consumption was minimal. While neighbors burned through cords of fuel trying to survive, Emmett used perhaps a tenth of a cord across those 6 brutal days. When the cold finally broke on January 24th, the settlement emerged from their cabins to assess the damage. Emmett ventured out for the first time in nearly a week, walking the frozen paths between scattered homesteads to check on neighbors and gather news. What he found confirmed his worst expectations. Cyrus Wellborn's family had suffered badly. His 2 children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6, both showed frostbite damage on their fingers and toes, despite spending the entire cold snap huddled near a fire that Cyrus had kept burning continuously. His wife had developed a cough that sounded dangerously close to pneumonia. The family had burned through more than half the remaining wood supply during those 6 days, leaving them dangerously short for the rest of winter. Cyrus looked exhausted, his face drawn and eyes hollow from lack of sleep. "We kept the fire going day and night," he told Emmett. "Never let it drop below a roar." And still the cabin stayed barely above freezing. Ice formed on the interior walls. The water bucket froze solid, 18 inches from the fireplace. Emmett said nothing, just nodded sympathetically. There was no satisfaction in being proven right when the proof involved children suffering frostbite. Ernst Baumann had fared slightly better, but had lost livestock. 3 of his chickens had frozen despite being housed in what he thought was an adequately protected coop attached to his cabin. His milk cow had developed frostbite on her teats, likely ending her productivity for the season. Ernst had burned through his carefully calculated wood supply at triple the rate he had anticipated. "I thought I was prepared," Ernst said when Emmett visited his cabin. "I cut more wood than I used the previous winter, but this cold, it is different. The cabin cannot hold any heat. I feed the fire constantly and gain almost nothing." Other families reported similar experiences. The Johansen family, Norwegian immigrants farming land along the river, had abandoned their cabin entirely on the coldest night and crowded into their barn with their livestock, using the animals' body heat for survival. The McCreary brothers, trappers working territory north of the settlement, had not been seen since before the cold snap began. Concern was growing that they might have frozen. 2 days after the cold broke, riders found the McCreary brothers' cabin. Both men were alive but badly frostbitten. They had survived by staying in their sleeping robes for 3 days straight, leaving only to feed their fire. One brother had lost feeling in 3 toes. The other had fingers that were blackened and would likely require amputation. They were brought back to the settlement for what medical care was available. The community's mood was grim. This was only January. 2 more months of winter remained, possibly 3. Wood supplies that should have lasted through March were depleted to dangerous levels. Families faced impossible choices about rationing fuel, accepting colder interior temperatures, or attempting to cut more wood in conditions that made outdoor work dangerous. Several families were talking about abandoning their claims, heading south to warmer territory or back east to civilization. The frontier promised opportunity, but it delivered hardship with brutal efficiency. Ernst Baumann appeared at the jail on a gray afternoon in early February. Emmett heard him calling from outside the iron door and went through the airlock to let him in. Ernst stepped into the cell block space between doors and stopped, shivering in the cold air that filled that intermediate zone. "Can we talk inside your cabin?" Ernst asked. Emmett led him through the second door into the cabin's interior. Ernst removed his heavy coat immediately, the warmth striking him after the bitter cold outside. He stood near the fireplace, holding his hands toward the modest flames burning there. "I need to understand how this works," Ernst said without preamble. "Not theory, not principles. I need to know exactly what you did and how I can do something similar before my family freezes." Emmett gestured to a chair at the table. "Sit. I will explain everything." Ernst sat but kept glancing around the cabin, cataloging details. "You are comfortable in here. Genuinely comfortable. I can feel it. This is not just slightly warmer than outside. This is warm enough to live normally. The system works as I calculated it would, Emmett said. The stone blocks wind and provides thermal mass. The air gap insulates. The cabin holds heat. Each element addresses a specific mechanism of heat loss. Can the same system be built elsewhere? I do not have an abandoned jail. You have the old stone warehouse on the eastern edge of your property. I have seen it. The walls are solid. The roof is intact. You could build a cabin inside it using the same principles I used here. Ernst considered this. The warehouse is larger than this jail. It would require more wood for the interior cabin. But you would save far more wood and reduced fuel consumption than you would spend in construction, and you would save it every winter for as long as the structure stands. Emmett pulled out his notebook and showed Ernst the temperature measurements he had recorded. Look at these numbers. During the worst cold, I maintained 41 degrees of warming while burning perhaps 1/10 the wood you burned. Ernst studied the careful columns of figures. This is real data, not estimates. Measured every morning and evening since September. I have 4 months of evidence proving the system's efficiency. Will you help me build it? I will pay you, provide labor, whatever you need, but I cannot do this alone, and I do not trust myself to build it correctly without guidance. Emmett had anticipated this request. I will help you. No payment necessary. But we start immediately. Your family cannot endure another cold snap like the last one. They began work the next morning. The old warehouse on Ernst's property was a stone structure built years earlier to store grain before the county seat moved. It was larger than the jail, roughly 30 feet by 40 feet, with walls 18 inches thick. The construction of Ernst Baumann's cabin-within warehouse proceeded rapidly with 2 men working. Emmett had learned efficiency through his own building process, knew exactly which steps mattered and which could be simplified. Ernst was a skilled carpenter, capable of executing techniques once they were explained. Together, they completed in 6 weeks what had taken Emmett 3 months working alone. The design followed the same principles as Emmett's jail cabin, but adapted to the warehouse's larger dimensions. A 3-foot air gap on all sides, double-door airlock entry, windows aligned with existing openings, and a carefully routed chimney system. Ernst's family moved into the completed structure in late March, just as another cold snap settled over the territory. The difference was immediate and dramatic. Ernst's wife wrote a letter to relatives back in Germany describing the new living quarters as warm as a house in town, warmer even, while using less firewood than we burned in our old cabin trying to stay merely alive. The children's frostbite healed. The persistent cough that had plagued Ernst's wife disappeared in the consistently warm, dry interior. Word spread with the speed that useful information always traveled on the frontier. By April, 3 other families were examining abandoned stone structures on their properties or nearby, calculating whether similar construction was feasible. Cyrus Wellborn, who had mocked Emmett's efforts so thoroughly, quietly asked Ernst for details about the building process. The McCreary brothers, recovering from their frostbite injuries, announced plans to build a cabin inside the old stone springhouse on their property. The Johansen family began constructing a wooden structure inside their barn, using the same air gap principle to create living quarters that would benefit from livestock heat while providing superior insulation. Spring of 1880 brought a wave of unconventional construction across the settlement. Not everyone had access to suitable stone structures, but those who did pursued the double-building approach with enthusiasm born of recent suffering. The technique was no longer Thorne's folly. It was becoming Thorne's method, a recognized solution to the specific challenge of surviving northern frontier winters with limited fuel resources. Emmett found himself in the unexpected position of advisor and consultant. People came to the jail seeking guidance on air gap dimensions, chimney routing, door construction. He shared information freely, drawing diagrams, explaining thermal principles in practical terms that unschooled frontiersmen could understand and apply. Cyrus Wellborn never apologized directly, but in May he stopped charging Emmett for supplies at the trading post. "Consider it payment for consulting," Cyrus said gruffly when Emmett questioned the change. "You saved people's lives this winter, whether they want to admit it or not." Ernst was more direct. "You were right, and we were all fools," he told Emmett over dinner at the Bauman family's new cabin. "You saw a problem, calculated a solution, and built it despite everyone telling you it was wasteful effort. That takes courage I did not recognize at the time." 5 years later, in 1885, the technique Emmett Thorne had pioneered had spread throughout the Northern Territories. Settlers in Minnesota, Dakota, Montana, and even parts of Wyoming were adapting the double structure principle wherever suitable stone buildings existed. The exact implementation varied based on available materials and individual skill, but the core concept remained consistent. Use stone for wind blocking and thermal mass, create an insulating air gap, build tight wooden living quarters inside, minimize direct connections between interior and exterior. Emmett himself had moved on from active trapping. At 34 years old, he had saved enough money to purchase farmland along the river. He married a widow from the settlement, a woman named Catherine, whose first husband had died in a farming accident. They had 2 children by 1885, and Emmett's life had transformed from solitary survival to family domesticity. But his original cabin inside the jail remained. He had sold the structure to a young trapper named Thomas Ridley, who continued living there and maintaining it. The cabin was now considered prime property, recognized as the most efficient shelter in the entire territory. Ridley reported fuel consumption that continued to validate Emmett's original measurements. During the winter of 1884 to 1885, Ridley survived on less than 3 cords of wood for the entire season, while standard cabins required 10 to 12 cords for the same period. Historians would later estimate that the double structure technique saved dozens of lives over the following decades. The exact number was impossible to determine because survival rarely generated records. People who stayed warm did not write letters about their good fortune, but accounts from the period included numerous references to families enduring severe winters specifically because they had built using Thorne's method. 1. Missionary traveling through Dakota Territory in 1887 wrote in his journal about visiting a family who had constructed a cabin inside an abandoned stone church. "The ingenuity of frontier people never ceases to amaze," the missionary wrote. "They have taken a building meant for worship and transformed it into a fortress against winter. The family told me they learned the technique from a trapper who had lost his partner to cold and refused to accept that standard building methods were adequate. His innovation has spread across hundreds of miles, saving lives and making harsh country slightly more habitable." The phrase "built like a Thorne cabin" entered frontier vocabulary as a compliment, signifying superior construction and thoughtful design. It meant someone had taken time to solve problems correctly rather than simply replicating traditional methods. It represented the difference between surviving and thriving in an environment that killed careless or unlucky people with efficient brutality. Emmett Thorne died in 1906 at the age of 55. He was buried in the cemetery at the settlement that had grown into a small town. His gravestone made no mention of his innovation or the lives it had saved. To most people, he was simply a farmer who had lived a quiet, successful life. But in the mountains and plains of the northern frontier, cabins built using his principles still stood, still sheltered families, still maintained impossible warmth against impossible cold. The technique had outlived its inventor, persisting because it solved a real problem with elegant simplicity: stone, air, wood. 3 elements combined in precise relationship to create something greater than any single component could achieve alone.